Coming up on this episode, previewing Golden State's first game of a 5-game road trip against the Houston Rockets on Saturday. The Warriors, they're reportedly more willing than ever to include Jonathan Kuminga in a massive trade. And could that include dealing for Giannis Antetokounmpo as the Warriors and rival teams monitor his situation in Milwaukee? Welcome back to the Golden State with Mates podcast, where it has just gone 7 a.m. at my time here in Australia, bright and early on a Saturday morning. I expected to wake up to some news surrounding Stephen Curry and D'Anthony Melton, who we'd heard and were told would be reevaluated with their injuries on Friday ahead of Saturday's game against the Rockets. So by the time you're listening or watching to this, that may have been the case, but I won't be able to give you an update or provide my thoughts on that. I'd still, for what it's worth, I'd imagine that at least Steph will still be out for the first couple of games of this road trip, which is going to be a huge one for the Warriors, starting with the Rockets on Saturday and then heading to Washington, Boston, Cleveland, and Oklahoma City. I've been thinking about this. What would be a pass mark for the Warriors on this 5-game road trip? Honestly, it does come down to how, when Steph's back and how many of those games he can play. But I would have thought if they can get two of those games, especially the first two, that's going to be their biggest opportunities. Now, maybe three. Three would be really good. Two, okay, but not ideal. And then anything else around that, one would be not great at all. And 4 or 5 would be unbelievable. And we'd have to start talking about the Warriors in a different light, I'd imagine, from there. But starting with this Rockets matchup on Saturday, I was watching their game against the Mavericks yesterday. They got a 108-102 victory there. And the thing that stood out for me was their defense against a really quality Mavericks offense, we know, with Luka, Kyrie, and Clay, etc. So they were really good defensively. It wasn't just a one-off. They're 6th in defensive rating so far throughout the season. And that's a little bit surprising to me when you look at their personnel. Like, you look at a backcourt of Jalen Green and Fred VanVleet, which is, Van Vliet's a good defender, but, he's not even 6 foot tall, barely 6 foot tall. Jalen Green is 6'4", not necessarily known as being a good defender by any means. And then when you got Şengün as kind of your anchor, your defense, the center position, you do wonder, if this is sustainable. But then they do have other guys like Dylan Brooks, we know is a good defender. Jabari Smith Jr. is long, athletic. They've got long, athletic guys coming off the bench. Tari Eason, Aman Thompson, Cam Whitmore. So they do have the makings of a reasonable defense, I suppose. And it's going to be interesting to see how they go against this Warrior team because, assuming Steph is out, then if the Rockets can make it a half-court game, I know this has been a big emphasis for me throughout these previews so far going into each game, but it's really going to be the pace to me and the Warriors trying to be an elite defensive team as they were against the Pelicans and allowing that to get themselves out into transition and get open looks that way. Otherwise, if it's in a half-court set, they might really struggle because we saw the Mavericks struggle yesterday in such a situation, and they've got 2 all-star caliber offensive players in Luka and Kyrie, and still one of the greatest shooters in the world in Klay Thompson. So I was really impressed with what the Rockets did defensively yesterday. Luka had 29 points, but I thought a lot of his looks weren't great. I think he shot 12 of 25 from the floor, so not overly efficient, but not bad either. 48% from the floor, that's actually not bad. But I thought some of the looks, and it was interesting listening to the Rockets broadcast. They were really honing in on trying to get Luka to be taking fadeaways or going away from the basket rather than to the basket, which we know Luka loves to step back threes and whatever else. But it was interesting to hear the Rockets broadcast saying to themselves, okay, we're living with Luka's step backs or fallaways or whatever else. We don't want him necessarily going to the basket. And I particularly think they did a great job on Clay. Clay made 2 threes but missed a lot, and there wasn't the wide open looks that Clay has been getting in the Mavs offense. What was the statistic? I think it was something like 28 of his first 33 three-point attempts for the season were on wide open or open looks. And watching that game yesterday, I just didn't think that was the case whatsoever. A lot of his looks were quite tough. And he wasn't getting that many, particularly in the first half anyway, because of the way that the Rockets were guarding. They were often playing Luka, Kyrie kind of straight up and basically asking those guys to beat them and trying to capitalize on their individual defenders, guarding those guys rather than setting two at the ball and potentially leaving Clay open for open and wide open looks, which he's been getting through the first few games of the season heading into that one. So I was impressed with the Rockets defense. They're currently 6th, as I said, on that end of the floor, 9th in offense, 6th in net rating overall. So they've had a really good start to the season. Their offense, I mean, they've got a lot of talented guys. Jalen Green's putting up 28.8 points per game right now on over 41% from three-point range, looking to showcase that contract that he got was at a 3-year, $106 million extension, was well worth it ahead of the October 21 deadline. Another guy who got an extension out, Brent Şengün. I love him as a player, very talented offensive player, can kind of do it all, 14.5 points, over 12 rebounds so far. It's going to be interesting to see that matchup because I've been speaking about, and again, another big point of emphasis for me has been TJD and him guarding against, these really talented offensive players. Şengün's not huge necessarily. I mean, he's a big body, but he's only 6'10". It's not like he's 7 foot tall. I don't know. This feels more like a Loon matchup to me, and I've been really interested to see kind of the push and pull with the Looney TJD minutes and which time Steve goes to one and which time Steve goes to another. I don't know. It was really fascinating to see Loon play more in the first game against the Pelicans and then TJD play a lot more in the second game. It's probably just going to come down to who's got it on a particular night, but I do think specific matchups are going to be pretty reasonable here in terms of choosing who you're going to go with on a given night out of Loon and TJD, because I think, albeit they're both similar size, they're both 6'9", they are very different. Like, they're both good defensive players, but they do it differently. Like, to me, TJD is a guy, genuine shot blocker. If you've got a guy, wing or a guard coming hard at the rim and you want a presence at the rim that can help, impact defensively, then I think TJD is your guy with his ability, vertical-wise to get up. As Loon, if you're coming up against, back to the basket post player, then I think he's still probably got the sturdier body to be able to handle that. And I think that's where, Şengün does his best work, oftentimes back to the basket. And I think that Loon could be a better matchup in that situation. Şengün is a similar-ish version to Sabonis at the Kings, I suppose. And we know that Loon has had success against Sabonis in the past. So that's going to be really interesting to me to see if, Steve goes to Looney a bit more in that matchup. Whether it's Draymond at the 5 and trying to exploit maybe Şengün up and down the floor in transition and maybe, perceives the lack of athleticism and speed getting back on defensive transition. So, I don't know, that's going to be an interesting one to me, but Şengün is a very talented offensive player. There's no doubt about that. And they've just got a bunch of wings, who can put up points. Van Vliet is at the point guard spot, has been setting things up really well for them. And then, Cam Whitmore's a spark plug off the bench oftentimes. Jabari Smith Jr. at the 4 spot, being able to stretch the floor. So, they've got some guys who can put up points, but I think it's the defensive end that I've been more impressed with them so far, and they're kind of leaning a lot on Jalen Green at the moment, and then other guys around that. I think they've got another, 5 guys averaging between 10 and 15 points. So they've got some depth there, and they're a really interesting team to me going forward in general, because they've probably at this point got too many young guys, where they're almost like the Warriors. They've got too many guys. The only issue for them is they've got too many young guys, as opposed to the Warriors, who a lot of their veteran pieces off the bench are veterans, exactly like they're GP2, Looney, Kyle Anderson, Melton, these guys, rather than young guys who are still trying to make their way in the league, who are still trying to earn their next contract off their rookie deal. And so, I don't know, the push and pull in the locker room of that, I think, is really fascinating. And, we've heard plenty of times about their activity and wants to get better via trade. And, particularly Kevin Durant, having interest in him. I think the Rockets are a team, almost like the Warriors, that might be best served with a 3-for-1 or a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 or even a 4-for-1 trade for a star player. Because they've got too many guys, too many young guys who deserve minutes but don't necessarily have the opportunity at the moment. It's going to be difficult for them to pull such a trade, because obviously guys like Green and Şengün, who would be huge pieces on the trade block if they were to put them out there. And I think there was a point where Jalen Green, and maybe there still is, where Jalen Green is on the market, particularly given his value would have soared based on how he's played at the start of the season. But then you've got that contract now, and both those guys are on poison pill contracts, which makes them very, very difficult to move, before the mid-season deadline in February. So they're an interesting team to watch from a trade standpoint as well as just their general rise in the Western Conference. Obviously, they had a little bit of a rivalry with the Warriors towards the end of last season, where they were trying to push for that playing spot, that 10 spot over the Warriors. I think they got within a game or two, and then kind of fell back. And once Tari Eason shot his mouth off from the sidelines, everything went a bit pear shaped for them, and the Warriors were able to secure that 10 spot in the West. The other thing to note here, which not important, but I think it's a nice little wrinkle to this, the Warriors have won the last 13 games in a row against the Rockets. So Golden State have had the wood over Houston for quite a while now. And even if you want to go, it's not just 13 games in a row, it's back to obviously the playoff days in the late 2010s where, the Warriors were going up against Harden and CP3 at that point as well, and a couple of really great battles that Houston had real opportunities in, only for them to kind of choke the bed a little bit and the Warriors capitalise. And obviously won that, a series in 7, won a series in 6, a couple of really good matchups there where the Warriors got the better of the Rockets, and it seems that's been the way over the past decade or so. Now, more recently, that 13-game winning streak is really down to the fact Houston have been bad, and I don't think that now they're pretty good again. They'll be trying to battle again for a play-in spot, maybe even more than that. And so I wouldn't expect that 13-game streak to extend too much more. Like, I'd expect a Rockets victory to come here, and it could certainly be tomorrow, particularly if and assuming that Stephen Curry is out, which is going to give them a big boost and make it all the more difficult for the Warrior offense, and probably make them even more reliant on their defense there as well. I don't think there's anything else in terms of the game. I think from a Warrior standpoint, I'd expect the same. Well, obviously Wiggins will hopefully be back, so I'm thinking probably Wiggins in for Waters maybe, and it'd be like Pods, Moody, Wiggins, Draymond, TJD, Kuminga still coming off the bench, hopefully playing big minutes. I think the Rockets, with their kind of length and athleticism, it's probably a good game for JK to try and match up to that, and for the Warriors to utilise him as much as possible. But we did have the report earlier today from The Athletic stating that rival executives believe the Warriors are more willing than ever to include Kuminga in a trade for a significant trade of significant magnitude. Let me start that again. Rival executives believe the Warriors are more willing than ever to include Kuminga in a trade of significant magnitude. Right. I don't think that's overly a surprise necessarily, because I think the Warriors have got themselves into a situation where they really need to decide on Jonathan Kuminga. Now, The Athletic reported in that same article that if the Warriors had their way, Jonathan Kuminga would be in a Jazz jersey right now, and he would have been included in a market and trade, which is interesting. I think there was a lot of, as a Warrior fan, I was pretty hopeful that the Warriors would have been able to get Markkanen without Kuminga, but obviously the Jazz didn't have too much interest given the contract situation with JK and having to pay him big money long term. And I think that's what the Warriors need to decide here. And I think they ultimately will probably, well, not probably, but they need to make a decision. And there could be a point where they think, okay, we're going to have to pay this guy $30 million in free agency. Is there someone out there in the meantime that we prefer to pay that money to, that is a genuine star, and that we're not taking that much of a risk with, right? And we're not guessing and paying on potential talent rather than output. So I think I'm not surprised that the Warriors would be willing to move JK in a big trade. But the issue is he's still only on $7 million. So any major trade for a guy making $30+ million right now, it's not just a 1-for-1 swap. It's, Andrew Wiggins as well. And right now, Wiggins has started the season exceptionally well. And would you want to move him for anything less than a bona fide multi-time All-Star? I wouldn't have thought so. And so that combination, like that package of Wiggins, Kuminga, that's still going to have to bring you back someone really good. And I'm even thinking like Jimmy Butler at 35 years old. Do I want to trade those two guys for Jimmy Butler? Not right now, no. Like, I don't want to do, like, Jimmy Butler's making over $40 million a year. He's probably going to want that on his next contract. He's got the ability to be a free agent next offseason, so he could just opt out and leave for nothing. And so giving up like a Wiggins, Kuminga, just those two guys to start with in any Jimmy Butler trade, I'm not sure I'd want to do that. But yes, Jimmy Butler's a better player. I get that. But he's 35 with an injury history, and he's going to want a big contract again, either via extension or if he opts out and he's an unrestricted free agent next offseason. So who is it? Who would you be willing to go and get and give up Wiggins and Kuminga in the process? Now, one of the guys that certainly you probably would, or not even probably, you would be willing to do that is Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I think we're on Giannis watch here a little bit now moving forward because I watched the start of that Milwaukee-Memphis game yesterday and it was horrid. It was horrible from a Milwaukee standpoint, particularly defensively. Like their defense at the moment, you think like a Giannis, Brook Lopez front court can try and hold it down a little bit, but their perimeter defense is that trade, that Damian Lillard trade where they get rid of Drew Holiday, he ultimately goes to the Celtics. I mean, it's made even worse by the fact he goes to Boston, wins the championship. But that trade in itself could be franchise altering in terms of that could have been the igniter to a path where we eventually see Giannis wanting out. And I don't think that's overreacting. I think that's a legitimate possibility because they desperately need a guy like Drew Holiday right now. It's crazy to think and see how bad their defense is on the perimeter right now. And they're relying on Gary Trent Jr., who's never really been known for his defense. I don't know, it's a tough watch for Milwaukee. And for Giannis, he puts up 37 points yesterday. He finishes as a net zero plus minus, and his team gets outscored by 23 in the 14 minutes he was off the floor. They have a first-round pick like Marjon Beauchamp, who they don't pick up his final year option on because their development of their young players hasn't been great in the past years. And that really hurts you when you need the depth pieces and you're trying to fill out the remainder of a roster where right now it's Dame, who had a stinky yesterday but has otherwise been okay. But outside of that, they look old. Outside of Giannis, not very athletic whatsoever. And I think their problems run far deeper than just relying on Chris Middleton to hopefully come back and be a savior, because I'm not sure how much you can rely upon that right now based on his injury history. And we haven't really seen, I mean, he was actually okay in the playoffs last season, but we really haven't seen too much from Chris Middleton over the last couple of years in terms of him being at his absolute apex of form. And we had, I think it was Bill Rita, I want to pronounce it, maybe I got that name wrong. It's certainly Rita, Rita or Writer, whatever. Teams, so he spoke, he's of CBS Sports, and spoke to a couple of anonymous executives around the league who I think there's optimism gaining on Giannis becoming available via trade one of these, so a couple of these statements here. Teams are circling and hopeful. One Western Conference team executive said, I wouldn't be surprised if it happened by the trade deadline, said another executive of a team that could be in the mix. So wouldn't be surprised if it happened by the deadline, which that would be a huge, huge acceleration. Like, I don't think that would be the case. Like, I think Giannis would probably want to see out the season and then even think, I mean, Milwaukee hold the cards, I don't think they would be necessarily pushing for that. They wouldn't be pushing for a Giannis trade at all, obviously, but I just don't think anything would necessarily happen before the deadline. Now, I mean, we saw Kevin Durant get traded from the Nets to the Suns, but that came after an off-season where he'd already requested a trade anyway. So I think there's still a bit to play out here with the Giannis situation, but we're certainly on watch in terms of monitoring that landscape there in Milwaukee. And the Heat and the Nets have already been mentioned as possible destinations and possible preferred destinations for Giannis. Now, the Warriors weren't on that, but there's that clip of him, that kind of TikTok video going viral again of him being asked to come to the Warriors and him kind of certainly not shutting it down, let's put it that way. So that certainly went viral after this report yesterday. I don't know, you'd certainly be willing to go all in for Giannis, and that's what, the Warriors are looking to add another starter pair with Steph, but they haven't been willing to go all in at this stage, right? They haven't been willing to go all in on Paul George. And rightly so, because, there was the leverage there of, he could just leave for nothing in free agency, which is ultimately what happened. There was a standoff between the Warriors and the Clippers just weren't willing to go into the second tax apron, which, again, their prerogative. And then with the marketing situation, it's like, okay, here's the deal. but we're not going to include Pods and keeping Pods out of the deal. There, obviously, it sounds like they were willing to give up Kuminga, certainly willing to give up Moody, willing to give up first-round picks, an assortment of, a combination of that kind of stuff, but not willing to include Pods, which is not going all in. I think you wouldn't have to worry about that with a Giannis situation. I think that he's a player, obviously 2-time MVP, 30 years old, so getting on, but not still in the prime of his career, really. Goes for 37-9 yesterday. Still one of the best, one of the top, I don't know, you could say top 3, at least top 5 players in the NBA, you would say. And so you go all in for that player. You give up the future picks, you give up Kuminga, you give up Pods, you give up Moody. I bet that's a bit more difficult given the poison pill contract he's now on. You do what you need to do to get Giannis Antetokounmpo. Right, you do that. And so that's a move the Warriors, you'd imagine, would be be willing to go all in on. The only issue here is the Bucks being in the second tax apron makes things really, really difficult from a trade standpoint because they can't trade out multiple players, so you can't add anyone with Giannis. They can't take back more salary, and because they can't take back more salary, because the Warriors are right up against the first tax apron themselves, like $500,000, it makes a trade very, very difficult. And it might be a case of if the Warriors want to trade for Giannis, they need to try and get a third team involved, like the Knicks did with getting the Hornets in on the Timberwolves trade that landed them cap. The Warriors might have to get pretty creative with that because otherwise it's very, very difficult to see how a trade could actually get done from a financial standpoint, given where the Bucks and Warriors are both at financially. The Warriors have done well to get themselves in a good financial position, but again, they're right up against the first tax apron, so they still can't actually take more. I mean, they can technically take more money back in a trade, but right now, given where they are, it can't be more than $500,000 because that's how much they are under the first tax apron, which they've hard capped themselves at. So I know I'd be also, as a Warrior fan, and for Warrior fans out there, I think you got to be careful what you wish for as well with the Giannis situation, because the last thing you want, if he becomes available in the trade market, yes, that gives you an opportunity to go and get him, and that could change the franchise. But it could also change the franchise of another team in the Western Conference. And you look at a team like the Oklahoma City Thunder, who could cash in all their assets for Giannis. If they get him and they manage to keep Chet and Shea at the same time, and maybe even Jalen Williams, then it's over. It's over. You've literally got no chance in the West. You have no chance. And so you got to be kind of careful what you wish for. Yes, we may want Giannis to become available to be able to go get him ourselves, but if we can't, then it could just strengthen another Western Conference rival to the point where you just have no chance of matching up against that team. So I think that's something just to be careful about. We can always be optimistic about, Giannis becomes available, the Warriors can go get him. There's going to be other teams, like the Warriors are going to be in the conversation, and more so than most other teams in the league because they do actually have the assets, and they've retained the assets after missing out on Georgia Markkanen. So they can be in the conversation, but there are teams that if the teams are willing, then they can outbid the Warriors if it just comes down to the highest bidder and who's willing to give up the most for Giannis. But he's certainly a fascinating watch, as is the Kuminga situation going forward. I'll finish up the episode there. If you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel already, that'd be greatly appreciated. You can follow me at POK252, that's POK252 on X/Twitter, also on Instagram, TikTok, Golden State with mates. I'll be back for a post-game live after Saturday's game against the Rockets. Let's hope the Warriors can move to 5-1, and otherwise have a great start to your weekend.